Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and we're going to continue talking about energy and matter, and now we're going to talk about the process by which plants convert photons, or that free energy coming from the sun, into stored energy, or into chemical energy, into potential energy, into carbohydrates. Okay, so that is the process that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how these green plants, again, you know why we see green now, okay? That's the photon wavelength that's being reflected. Okay, these green plants, when we dive into their cells, okay, this is their cell, that rectangular shape structure, that rigid cell wall. Inside of it, there are these little green molecules, or these green organelles. These green organelles are called chloroplasts. And chloroplasts, inside them, they have an antenna complex. Okay, and we're going to watch a video that's a little bit technical. It's created by the institution that I got my PhD from, but I think it's one of the better videos out there on, demonstrating kind of the pathway of photosynthesis. We're going to cover quite a bit of this pathway again, and some of it we're not going to discuss because it's a little more technical than we need to get into. But just realizing that inside the chloroplast there are an antenna complex. An antenna, you can think of it as kind of like a dish that's trying to capture photons. And in that antenna complex are chlorophyll molecules. That's why we see here that green. There are also other molecules, carotenoids, xenophils, keratins, that have that ability to collect those photons that are in the different wavelength than the chlorophyll molecules are capturing. Okay? So again, we're going to watch a quick little video about how this works, and then we're going to cover some of these things in a little bit greater detail in some cases, and a lot less detail in other cases.
The process of photosynthesis produces ATP from ADP and PI by using the energy from light to excite electrons that are passed along an electron transport chain. Coupled with the transfer of electrons is the pumping of hydrogen ions and the splitting of water molecules. The following complexes are found in the photosynthesis electron transport chain: photosystem II, cytochrome B6F, photosystem I, ferredoxin NADP reductase, and the complex that makes ATP, ATP synthase. In addition to the complexes, 3 mobile carriers are also involved: plastoquinone QB, plastocyanin, and ferredoxin. Other key components include photons, chlorophyll molecules, protons, water, molecular oxygen, NADP and the electrons to form NADPH, and ADP and PI, which combine to form ATP. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts of plants and algae. The process is also found in single-cell organisms, such as cyanobacteria, that do not have chloroplasts. Like its mitochondrial counterpart, the chloroplast electron transport chain consists of several protein complexes and mobile electron carriers. First, a photon of light hits a chlorophyll molecule surrounding the photosystem II complex. This creates resonance energy that is transferred through neighboring chlorophyll molecules. When this energy reaches the reaction center embedded in photosystem II, an electron is released. The reaction center chlorophyll contains electrons that can be transferred when excited. One photon is needed to excite each of the electrons in this chlorophyll. Once excited, 2 electrons are transferred to plastoquinone QB, the first mobile carrier. In addition to the 2 electrons, QB also picks up 2 protons from the stroma. The 2 electrons lost from photosystem II are replaced by the splitting of water molecules. Water splitting also releases hydrogen ions into the lumen. This contributes to a hydrogen ion gradient similar to the one created by mitochondrial electron transport. After 2 water molecules have been split, 1 molecule of molecular oxygen is created. Plastoquinone QB then transfers the 2 electrons to the cytochrome B6F complex. The 2 protons it picked up are released into the lumen. These transfers are coupled with the pumping of 2 more hydrogen ions into the lumen space by cytochrome B6F. The electrons are next transferred to plastocyanin, another mobile carrier. Next, the electrons are transferred from plastocyanin to the photosystem I complex. It is here that photons again energize each electron and propel their transfer to ferredoxin. Ferredoxin then transfers the electrons to the ferredoxin NADP reductase, also known as FNR. After 2 electrons are transferred to FNR, NADPH is made by adding the 2 electrons and a hydrogen ion to NADP. The gradient created by the electron transport chain is utilized by ATP synthase to create ATP from ADP and PI. This is similar to the way ATP is synthesized in the mitochondria. ATP, NADPH, and molecular oxygen are the final vital products of photosynthesis.
Okay, so I know that video had some big words like ferredoxin and reductase and synthesis and plastocyan, but the premise of it you should get. And that is that a photon comes in, light energy comes in, it's captured by the antenna complex. They're just showing you chlorophyll molecules there, but we've discussed that there's other molecules there. Okay, it's not just chlorophyll, and there are a couple types of chlorophyll, A and B, but there's also carotenoids, xanthophylls, keratins inside that antenna complex. So that photon is captured, that energy is transferred, and it allows for the end product, 2 end products. One is NADPH, which we'll come back to. It's important for cellular respiration. Well, it's important for the Calvin cycle. Okay, and then we'll talk about that. And then ATP, and we already talked about ATP. ATP is energy. So this system is taking photons and converting that energy into stored energy or chemical energy in the form of ATP. That ATP can then be utilized to do work elsewhere. And so that's important to keep in mind. Now we're going to look at how some scientists figured a lot of this process out. Okay, so a Dutch physician by John Ingenhousz did an experiment much like Joseph Priestley's experiment, in which he placed plants in sealed containers. So remember, Priestley did this also. He put plants with a mouse in a sealed container to see how long the mouse would live. He also put the mouse with a candle and see, what happened to the atmosphere, etc. But Ingenhousz did it a little bit differently. He examined the role that plants play inside a closed system. He also utilized that thought process of what role is the sun playing in the system? Is it really that important that we have sun? So he put, the plants in the sunlight, and then he put some in the shade, and he looked at the effects that those plants have on the atmosphere inside that closed container. Okay. And what he found out, that the plants that were in the shade that didn't have that interaction with photons did not alter the environment in the jar. Now, most of you have probably seen a situation where you have a plant inside a jar or inside of a container, inside a plastic bag, and you would notice that moisture is building on the outside surface of the container, etc. So that's what Ingenhousz's ideas were. Well, are these plants able to change the atmosphere in these containers? He figured out that indeed the plants that were in the sun were increasing the level of oxygen inside the jar. Not only oxygen, but also moisture, was building on the inside of the jar. And we'll look at that because that's transpiration. So this is how they discovered that plants release oxygen, and at the same time, when they open their pores, which are called stomata, when they open them up and oxygen leaves, so does water. Right? And we'll come back to this. Okay? More on that, he also discovered that plants had the ability to do this photosynthesis underwater. Okay? And so he really discovered, Ingenhousz really discovered, with the help of all the experiments that came before him, he really discovered the process of which photosynthesis can occur and the players in photosynthesis, that carbon dioxide is being converted into sugar, that water is a key component to that conversion. He didn't know the role that water plays in donating electrons, but he did know that water is where the hydrogen ions for that carbohydrate are coming from. And he found out that sunlight, that the photons are where the initial spark, the initial energy is coming from to make that conversion. And like I said before, he also noticed that photosynthesis can be done underwater. Okay? And he realized very quickly that in his experiment, he was fairly sure, his terrestrial experiment, when he put the plant in the jar, he was fairly sure that oxygen levels were increasing. But to confirm this, he looked at aquatic plants, and he saw this. Okay? He saw bubbles forming when he had aquatic plants with lights on them. Okay? Doing photosynthesis, he saw bubbles forming, and he figured out that that was indeed oxygen inside those bubbles, that the plant was releasing oxygen. Now, here's a big component to photosynthesis that we often think that plants create oxygen and they take up carbon dioxide. This is very true, but I want you to think about it from a plant's perspective, or from another organism's perspective other than humans. Plants did not evolve to support humans or to support life with oxygen. It's not true, because we know it's not true, because if plants have to hold oxygen in their tissue, it will kill them. Okay? So oxygen to plants is actually toxic. Okay? It messes with the light independent reaction, which we call the Calvin cycle. It messes with the Calvin cycle by oxygen binding to a molecule called RUBP. Oxygen will bind to that, and it won't allow for the Calvin cycle to make sugars. And that's what the role of the Calvin cycle is, or the light independent cycle, is to make sugars. So when we often think, because we're humans and we are told this, oh yeah, plants are what's making oxygen for our planet. This is true, but realize from a plant perspective, it's just getting rid of waste. It's getting rid of oxygen because oxygen is toxic to plants. It's just like thinking about it from our standpoint. Are we making carbon dioxide so plants can breathe? Are we making carbon dioxide so plants can make carbohydrates? We would never say that. We're not making carbon dioxide so that. We're making carbon dioxide because it's a waste product of our body. Oxygen is a waste product of plants. Carbon dioxide is needed by plants. That's the beauty of the photosynthetic cellular respiration system. One organism's waste is another organism's source of energy. And that's why it's so beautiful to know the entire system and how it works. All right, so we already discussed this in quite a bit of detail, that green plants, so if you're looking at a plant and it has a green leaf, okay, you now know that green color is reflecting back the part of the spectrum of visible light that plant cannot absorb. Okay. So in this case, if it's green, it's absorbing everything but green. But let's say you walk up to a plant and the plant's leaves are not green, they're red. Then you would know that all the parts of the spectrum besides red are being absorbed. Same thing with flowers. So you walk up to a plant and you see the petals of a flower, maybe they're yellow. Okay? Everything besides yellow is being absorbed. Okay? And in many cases, that absorption of all those other photons is being utilized to drive work or to make chemical energy. Okay. So that kind of brings us full circle, or we're trying to get full circle. So what does this relationship, what does the photon absorption relationship have to do with the mass of a plant? What does it have to do with how plants gain mass? How we go from a minuscule little tiny seed to 50,000 pounds of tissue? Well, the process is photosynthesis. That's how it's done. Okay? So that experiment, that original willow experiment by John Baptist, was replicated after, hundreds of years later, after individuals started realizing, whoa, we're starting to build knowledge about this system called photosynthesis, about this, this pathway called photosynthesis. Now we can re-examine the willow experiment, but now we can start examining what is that mass being added. And so Susar, he replicated that willow tree experiment, and it measured the changes in carbon dioxide level in the plant's container. He concluded that the mass gained by plants as they grow was not from the soil. Okay? It's not from the nutrients in the soil. but it came from the air. It came from absorbing carbon dioxide. Also associated with that is the absorption of water from the soil. But the nutrients that are found in the soil didn't change a whole lot. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about, when we talk about, plants and stuff like that, we're going to talk about the role that nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium play in plant growth. Okay? But realize that, yes, they play a big role in plant growth, in how much new tissue is put on, when flowers can be made, when fruits can be made, etc. But that actual body tissue of a plant is based on carbon dioxide from the air, okay, mixed with water from the soil. That's what's making cellulose. Cellulose is the building block and what we typically call wood. That's what wood is made out of, is cellulose, which is long strands of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay? And this is the equation for how that works. So when I talk to you about photosynthesis equation, you need to know this equation. It's a very simple equation. And yes, it may differ in different plants, but overall, this is kind of the average that we see when we talk about the photosynthesis equation. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide comes from the atmosphere. 6 molecules of water comes from typically the soil, okay, or whatever the plant is growing in. That water is going to come from that. Sometimes if a plant's growing on another plant, it's stealing the water from them. Okay? Sometimes, if a plant's growing in water, then, there's no soil involved. But 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water. Here, this is indicating that you have to have photons. You have to have that free energy from the sun. This is combined to form glucose, okay, or some carbohydrate. Typically, it's glucose, and then glucose is combined with other molecules to form more advanced carbohydrates. So you take glucose and you configure it and combine it with other glucose molecules or fructose molecules or sucrose molecules, and you can make more advanced carbohydrates like starches and cellulose, and you can make sucrose and other types of storage molecules, right? Chemical stored energy. And a product of this, which I want you to think as a waste product of this situation, is 6 molecules of oxygen. Okay? Again, oxygen is not a product of photosynthesis per se. Oxygen is a waste product of photosynthesis. Just like carbon dioxide is a waste product of cellular respiration for us. Okay? If you don't get rid of carbon dioxide, it will poison you and you will die. If plants don't get rid of oxygen, it will poison them and they will die. Okay? So I can't emphasize that enough. Got to think about it from a plant's perspective. They're not creating oxygen for us. It's a waste product from the formation of this glucose or other carbohydrates. So that brings us to cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, you can think of it basically as taking that equation you just saw and turning it around, flipping it around, and reversing the system. Sun's not involved. Okay? So animals and fungi don't have that ability, okay, and a lot of protozoans don't have that ability to create their own energy. So they're not autotrophs, they're heterotrophs. So that means that they have to consume their energy. that consumption is part of cellular respiration. Now, I want to make sure that you understand this. Just because animals and fungi don't get and have the capability to create their own food sources does not mean that they're the only organisms that do cellular respiration. No, that's not true. Plants, bacteria, that all are autotrophs, they also do cellular respiration. Okay? It just happens to be, it's a closed system for them. They can create their own carbohydrates from absorbing photons. Then they can take those carbohydrates and they can break them down through the process of cellular respiration into utilizable energy. But it's all in one system. They don't have to consume another organism. Animals and fungi, on the other hand, they don't have the capability of taking those photons and making that carbohydrate. Instead, they just have to consume it and do the process of cellular respiration. Okay? So cellular respiration is the process by which we break potential energy, chemical energy. Okay? You break it down into smaller components, and when you break bonds, electrons are released. Those electrons give you the capability to do work. Okay? Give you the capability to bind other molecules together, okay? And to be able to drive energetic processes like firing your nerves, moving your muscles. Okay? These kind of things all evolve around that ability to break down molecules into smaller components and release energy in that process. So here's that opposite part of that equation. So remember, the end products of photosynthesis is glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, 6 molecules of oxygen. Well, if you flip it and you say, okay, now we're going to take that glucose and we're going to take 6 moles of oxygen. This is what we would consume. Okay, this is why you breathe, is you need oxygen to drive cellular respiration. Okay? So you're taking that in, you're converting it into carbon dioxide, that's the waste product that's leaving. You're converting that into metabolic water. This is why we urinate, and other organisms produce other types of waste, but this is why we urinate and utilize this product to form metabolic water. And then the big one, okay? This results in the formation of ATP. Okay? And it's about 38 ATP depending on the organism. Okay? Now some of that ATP has to be spent to drive this ability, because remember, when we look at plants, right here at the double arrow is the sun. They have energy, free energy coming in to drive their process. We don't have free energy in the process of cellular respiration. So we have to burn some of this energy to get this to work, to get more energy out of it. So you have to utilize some energy to break glucose to get the ATP at the end. Okay. Now, here's another big kicker. This ATP right here, yes, it is stored energy in the form of ATP, but ATP doesn't last very long. ATP, you can't store a massive amount of ATP. Instead, you have to store, if you need energy as a reserve, you have to store these molecules of energy. Glucose, fructose, sucrose, okay? Fats, proteins, nucleic acids, you have to store them as a reserve, and that's why we have fat molecules, It's because then we can take that fat and we can convert it back into something that we can utilize in cellular respiration to form ATP. ATP is not a storage molecule. And I already talked about this. It's got 3 phosphates. They're all negative, like 3 negative magnets stuck together. This doesn't last long. It wants to come apart. It wants to release its energy so you can do work, so you can fire your nerves, walk, run, eat things, play baseball, whatever it might be. It wants you to be able to do that by releasing its energy. So it doesn't stick around for very long. So we have to do this process constantly, all the time. And if you take in a bunch of energy, you store it as fat, and then you convert that fat into usable energy at a later time. Again, photosynthesis and cellular respiration you can think of them as a giant cycle, a giant circle. Photosynthesis feeds cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is how those carbohydrates, how those glucose molecules are being formed. Okay? So photosynthesis is creating those potential energy chemical bonds. It's then taken, and cellular respiration is breaking them up to get usable energy. Okay? As a product of that photosynthesis, oxygen, that waste product of plants, is being released. It's being picked up by an organism along with the glucose and being utilized through cellular respiration. Waste products of carbon dioxide are being released to go back into the plants. Water is being released to go back into the plants. And it's all a giant system. And it all starts with this free energy from the sun. Without the photons, without the free energy from the sun, the system is broken. And the system doesn't work. And that's where it comes in. And such a player, such a big deal is that these plants evolved the ability to capture photons and use this free energy to drive this system. Okay? And heterotrophs wouldn't be on the planet if it wasn't for the autotrophs that devised an evolutionary system to be able to capture these photons and drive formation of chemical bonds. Okay, so energy flow. Energy has to follow laws of thermodynamics. Okay? 2 laws of thermodynamics that I want to talk about. Okay? So over here, you can see how energy is transformed. You take this chemical energy, you transform it into motion. You can take radiant energy from the sun, you can transform it into chemical energy. You can take chemical energy, you can transform it into motion. See, there's all kinds of ways at which energy flows and energy transfers. But they have to obey the laws of thermodynamics. Okay? The first law of thermodynamics is that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It only changes form. Okay? So it is often stated that plants are creating energy, but they're not creating energy. They're transforming energy. The energy is coming from photons, from the sun. And all the plants are doing is reconfiguring that energy into chemical energy. And then you eat that plant, okay, you just replace this ice cream with this plant, and you can convert it into energy that allows motion to occur. Okay? So energy is not created nor destroyed. It just changes form. It just changes from being potential energy to kinetic energy, being thermal energy to captured energy in a plant. Okay? in a chemical form. Okay? And the second law of thermodynamics is that when you transfer energy from one form to another, some of that energy is lost. Okay? Depending on the transferability, how well those organisms can transfer that, or how well our system can transfer it, energy is lost. It's lost in the form of heat. Eventually, that heat escapes our planet. Okay? Because again, you have these photons coming in, that free energy is coming in, it's being converted through different processes on our planet, and some of that conversion, some of that transformation, that heat energy is being lost back out. Okay? So another way to look at this is that systems are not completely stable. Systems, if left over a long period of time, will break down. It takes energy to maintain those systems. Okay? And because of that, because that energy is needed to maintain those systems, that role that the photons play on the planet is huge, because you're always getting a source of energy coming onto the planet. That energy has to be utilized to maintain the current systems. Some of that energy is wasted during transformations and released back into the atmosphere. Next time, we're going to talk about food chains.